So this is the beginning of the optional paragraphs in our contract. So everything we have talked about up until now have been the standard provisions of the contract. None of them should be taken out of the contract. They are all left alone. All of the blanks in there, everything through paragraph 28 should either have something in the blank or an N/A, as I mentioned before. This is where we start with the paragraphs are a part of this contract only if they're initialed by the parties. So way back on page 1, on line, I think it's 4, it said that I am a dual agent. I checked the box and it said, and complete paragraph 29. So if in fact I am a dual agent and I'm writing out this contract with my buyer, I should have had him come to paragraph 29 before I did anything else and say, I am a dual agent. I need you to give me consent to continue as a dual agent. Now remember, this is not your first disclosure of dual agency. You had to get permission from your seller to be a dual agent when you listed the property. You needed permission from the buyer to be a dual agent before you showed the property to the buyer. But if you remember, the license law says that we have to have confirmation of consent to dual agency at the time we are writing a contract. So it should be the first thing that the buyer says, yep, I'm okay with it. And then when you go to present this contract to your seller, it should be the first thing that the seller gives you permission to do. Because if either one of them say no, you can't continue. You need to get your managing broker involved and they will walk you through whatever your company policy is on how you deal with a transaction when either the buyer or the seller tell you you cannot continue to be a dual agent when you get to the writing of the contract, okay? So the next thing that's in here is probably the most complicated. I know you're going, worse than the attorney modification and the home inspection and the financing, and the answer is yes. Probably the most complicated and certainly the longest paragraph in the entire contract. So where are we at? This is when the buyer has a property he needs to either sell or he has to close on prior to being able to, in order to be able to close on the house he's buying. So your buyer's buying my seller's house. Your buyer has not put his house on the market yet. He got really excited when he saw my seller's house come up for sale and he wants to try to buy it. So let's start with that premise. So the line 378 is what is the house your buyer currently has to sell in order to buy mine? So you're going to write the address in there. Now, number 2 says buyer has or has not entered into a contract to sell their real estate. In the example I just gave you, he has not. It says that if buyer has entered into a contract, that contract is, you would not fill out A, B, and C under 2 because he has not entered into a contract. Then 3 says buyer has or has not publicly listed their real estate for sale. So if you have listed your buyer's house, but he hasn't sold it yet, you could check the box that says he has listed his property for sale. And then it says if buyer's real estate is not listed for sale. So now, if you checked has listed the property, then you would not have to do 4 because it says buyer's real estate is not publicly listed. So let's go back to 3. If you check the box that says has not listed their house for sale, what is your buyer intending to do with their house? A says, 4A says, he shall publicly list the real estate for sale within 5 business days after date of acceptance, and this is who they're going to list it with. And if they don't know who they're going to list it with yet, they don't have to fill it in because it's for information only. Or the buyer could say, I do not intend to list said real estate for sale. So now what are you telling me? You're telling me that your buyer has a house to sell. They are not going to list it and they're going to go for sale by owner or some cockamamie thing. And I got to tell you right now, my seller's probably going to come back and say, I don't think so, because I'm not taking my house off the market, almost off the market, while you're out trying to sell it for sale by owner. Okay, so now That's what happens if they have not entered into a contract. So now let's do it if they did. So now your buyer has a contract on their property, but he cannot close on the next one unless he closes on his. Now remember, back in the financing paragraph, it said that this contract is not contingent on the sale or closing of the buyer's property unless you use paragraph 30. So if your buyer cannot close and own 2 houses, it makes sense that you would make the purchase of my seller's house contingent on the closing, not the sale, but the closing of your buyer's house. So in this case, number 2, he has entered into a contract. And now A, B, and C are all about that contract. Is that contract subject to a mortgage contingency? Is that contract subject to a real estate sale contingency? Is that contract subject to a real estate closing contingency? In other words, my seller needs to know how many dominoes need to fall here before your buyer is going to be able to close on my seller's house. Does that make sense? So this whole section here that you're looking at is all about your seller's property. I'm sorry, your buyer's property and what he's doing with it, okay? Because he's saying he doesn't have to close on my seller's house unless something happens here. So what is that something? What are the contingencies? So the contingencies are, number 1, this contract is contingent on the buyer having entered into a contract for the sale of his real estate. So that makes it contingent on the sale. This one makes it contingent on the closing. So if you're going to use the sale contingency, you need to use the closing contingency. So if you're going to use 1, you need to use 2. But if you are going to, you could do it without using 1. That's when it would be only contingent on the closing. So this is the closing contingency. All right, so you've got home sale, home closing. So what does all this mean to the seller? Oh, I forgot about this one. Before we do that, if the contract for their real estate is terminated for any reason. So now you come to me and you say, my buyer's got a contract on his property, but that contract is contingent on, it's contingent on a mortgage. And now you find out that the buyer who's buying your buyer's house, following this, have you got a map in front of you? The buyer buying your buyer's house, he couldn't get his mortgage. The deal fell through on your buyer's sale. You have to tell me that, and you have to tell me that within 3 business days, because that means it's no longer contingent just on the closing. Now we would have to make it contingent on the what? On the sale again, because his deal fell through. Could my seller say bye-bye to your buyer now and say, no, I was okay with the home closing, I'm not okay with the home sale contingency? Absolutely, he could. Absolutely. Okay, so now the seller has a right to continue to keep their home on the market. So the seller's going to, and when my seller accepts your home closing contingency, let's use that. It goes in our MLS as an HC with a set of numbers after it, HC 24 or 48 or 72. And that's where these numbers come from. My seller has accepted a home closing contingency, HC. And if it was a home sale contingency, it shows up in the MLS as an HS with the numbers after it. So I'm telling everybody in the MLS, we have a contract, home sale or home closing contingency, continue to show. If your buyer wants to buy it, and what's going to happen is if a second buyer comes along to buy it, and my seller accepts that contract, he is going to notify buyer number 1 in writing, and the buyer will then have blank number of hours to waive his contingencies or drop his contract. So that's where, and it would say 24 or 48 or 72. All right, that's where that comes from. So the seller can keep their house on the market. If another offer comes in, they're going to bump out that first contract. So the seller's notice to the buyer has to be in writing, and I am going to show you a copy of that notice. I'm going to show you a copy of that notice at the end of the contract discussion so that you can see what it is, because often we are the ones that have to serve that notice. And often we end up doing it by personal delivery if the person lives in town. And this goes on to say that we have the right to do that. So the kickout notice is in writing, shall be served on the buyer, not on the buyer's attorney, not on the buyer's real estate agent, because if he's only got 24 hours to decide what to do, we don't want to be giving it to the attorney or to one of us, because he could lose the house in that 24 hours while we tried to find him. So it has to, doesn't start until we give it to them. So all of the ways we do that are in there. And if you look at number 6 down at the bottom, it says buyer waives any ethical objection to the delivery of the notice under this paragraph by seller's attorney or representative. In other words, by law, we are not supposed to be talking to directly or having anything to do with somebody else's client in our transactions. It all has to go through the agents. This is the only exception to that. So if your buyer lives in town and I have to serve him a notice that my seller accepted another contract, I can deliver it to him directly, okay? And that's basically what it calls for in that paragraph. So this says that the buyer authorizes the seller or the seller's agent to verify everything. So that only means that we are going to verify that the property is listed. We have a right to get that information and know exactly what your buyer is doing with his property. Up at the top, above where it says buyer cooperation required, it says waiver of paragraph contingencies. Basically what that's saying, if you'll just take a look at that, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, but it's there. Buyers deemed to have waived his contingencies when the buyer delivered written waiver and deposited additional earnest money in the amount of blank. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about. So if I am the listing agent and I'm selling a $500,000 house with a home sale contingency, and we agreed to only take $1,000 worth of earnest money on the front page because it was a contingent contract, I want more money from your buyer when he drops his contingency, because a $500,000 buyer will drop his contingency, keep my seller from selling their house to the next buyer, and risk that $1,000. So I am probably going to want a heck of a lot more money here. I'm going to want enough money here to make your buyer seriously think about how he's not going to go forward with buyer number 1 is not going to go forward with this transaction. Buyer number 1 is not going to want to go through with this transaction unless he's darn sure that he's going to be able to close on that. So he won't play games with my seller. Okay. So let's move to, there we go, paragraph 31. So this is the paragraph that the second buyer agent would use to try to bump out the first contract. And anytime you want to be a backup contract, you could use this as well. So it says that in the event either party has entered into a prior real estate contract, this contract shall be subject to written cancellation of the prior contract on or before. So how much time are you going to give the listing agent to bump out that first contract? And a lot of that is going to depend, obviously, on the bump out notice that was in there. So what did it say in the MLS? It said it was an HS 72. Well, then you're going to have to give him at least 3 days because that's how long that buyer had to make up his mind. So this goes on to say, in the event the prior contract is not canceled within the time specified, then this contract is null and void. Done. Over. We don't have to do anything. If the prior contract is subject to paragraph 30 contingencies, the seller's notice to the purchaser under the prior contract is not served until after the attorney review and professional inspection provisions of this contract have expired, satisfied, or waived. In other words, I'm not bumping out the first buyer only to find out that the second buyer's attorney or the home inspector came up with some absolutely inane things that caused me not to want to go forward with it. So your buyer, if he wants to bump out a prior contract, needs to move forward a little bit with his before we'll do the bump, okay? But this is the paragraph that is also used if all you want to do is make this a backup contract. There is already a contract on the property. There is no paragraph 30 involved. There is no kick out in it. Your buyer just wants to lay in the weeds and wait to see whether or not the first buyer screws up and he can get the house. So you can use this for that. And how long your buyer wants to be a backup is entirely up to your buyer. But often, if, for example, if I have multiple offers on my seller's property, my seller takes the offer from agent A's buyer, and I go to agent B and I say, they took the other offer, do you want to be a backup contract? And B talks to their buyer and says, yes, and we're willing to be a backup for 15 days because that's the attorney review home inspection time. And that way we can, so if we wrote it on the 1st, we'll be good for the 5th till the 15th. Because if it's going to fall apart, I don't know that any buyer as a backup is going to want to wait more than 15 days. Reminder, he is in a backup contract. This is a contract if you use this. And if it's signed by the buyer and the buyer can't go out and buy other houses. So, but it can be used to be a straight backup.